Whether you're studying, working on your internal assessment, whether you're meditating after a long, stressful day, whether you're in the gym lifting weights or going for a run, your body is in constant negotiation with the atmosphere to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Today, we're going to explore this relationship further in your respiratory system. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Physical Educator. Today's episode is about the respiratory system. Before we get started, if you want any other IB Sports Science videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Teachers, you can visit the TES website for any teaching resources for this section too. Let's get straight into it. We're going to start with the objectives as we do with every video. What I want to draw your attention to here is again what's on the right hand side. For this unit is all three assessment objectives, 1, 2 and 3, meaning that in some of the topics we're going to have to put an explanation behind what we're talking about. That means we have to go in detail when learning these two aspects. There is some objective ones, which is just define and label and list. So they're nice and straightforward, but you need to make sure that you repeat, so that information seeps into your long-term memory. So the first section we need to look at is Unit 2.1.1. This is the principal structures within the respiratory system. We're going to start with what takes the air in from the atmosphere. And there's two cavities that do this. Our nasal cavity, our nose, is the first and primary function for breathing and taking in oxygen from the air. It helps to filter and warm the air as it breathes it in. We also have the mouth, our second cavity, which takes in oxygen from the environment. Both of these cavities are met at the back of the throat in the pharynx. This is where the two airways become one. The pharynx then transports the air down to the larynx, our voice box, but it has another purpose. It's where the epiglottis is, and it has a specific role in preventing food and liquid from going down the wrong tube. Our trachea is next. It's a long, thick, cartilage-rich tube that stays wide open so air can travel through on its journey towards the lungs. At the end of the trachea is where we branch right and left into each lung, and these are called the bronchi. The left bronchus and the right bronchus. What I want you to think about with the bronchi is a trunk of a tree. That's their job. They go into each lung. They think of them as a trunk of a tree. After the trunk of a tree, you have branches, and you have many branches. Inside our lung is exactly the same. We have many bronchioles at the end of each bronchi, which increase the surface area massively so oxygen can spread all over the lung. At the bottom of the lung, just underneath it, there is a muscle, and this muscle is called the diaphragm, and we'll look further later at how the diaphragm works to assist us with breathing. At the end of the bronchioles, there are air sacs called alveoli, and these are the important aspect of the lungs when we talk about gas exchange. This is where it takes place. Little air sacs at the end of the bronchioles, and to complete our tree analogy, they are like the leaves. Now we've looked at the primary structures within the respiratory system, we now need to look at the conducting airways and what their function is within the respiratory system. And I've split this up into three areas for you. As you can see, the conducting airways, it warms and moistens air, it lowers air pressure, and it protects the trachea. These are the 3 points we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. Starting with warming and moistening the air. So the air gets breathed in through the nose. Within the nose, it gets warmed and moistened, so when the air gets to the lungs, it's in a wet state. You don't want a dry gas going into the lungs. The lung is a very wet and moist organ, and it needs the air to come into the lung in the same state. And the nose helps that process by warming and moistening the air as it enters. As the air continues its journey down to the pharynx, this is where the air pressure gets lowered as it funnels its way down into the trachea, and the low air pressure enables it to enter the lungs in the state that it needs to be. The last point that we need to look at here is within the larynx and the entrance to the larynx where the epiglottis is. This is vital. We've all had a drink before or eaten some food and it feels like it's gone down the wrong hole and we've choked. It obviously hasn't gone down the wrong hole, but there has been some pressure put on the epiglottis and it causes us to choke, and it temporarily closes our trachea. That's why we feel like we can't breathe. The epiglottis's purpose is exactly what I've just described. It stops the wrong objects going down the trachea, and it allows, when you breathe, pure air to go down the trachea into the bronchi and then into the lungs. So that is the three functions of the conducting airways that we need to look at for this section. Next, we need to look at the lung volumes and capacities. Now, we should have a base knowledge of this from GCSE. We should have looked at tidal volume, total lung capacity, residual volume, and vital capacity within our GCSE PE, if that's what you studied before you did the IB Sports Science. We now need to go a little bit further than that. So we're going to go through all the definitions that are required within the IB course, starting with pulmonary ventilation. This simply means you're breathing. It's as simple as that. It's the inflow and the outflow of air between the atmosphere and the lungs as you breathe. Now we're going to look at some of the volumes. Our next one is tidal volume. Again, this is the state of normal breathing. So the volume of air that's breathed in and out normally. Now during exercise, your tidal volume will increase and your IRV and your ERV will slightly decrease. Next, we need to look at our ERV, expiratory reserve volume. This is the volume of air in excess of tidal volume that can be exhaled forcibly. So take a normal breath out, and then on top of your breath out, forcibly breathe out as well. Give that a go. That is called your expiratory reserve volume, and at any time, you can use your expiratory reserve volume. Just do a normal breath, and breathe out extra that normal breath, and that is your expiratory reserve volume. It's reserve because it's there ready to go, expiratory because you're breathing out, and it's the volume, the total that you can do of that. After your ERV, we also have the IRV, the inspiratory reserve volume. This is exactly the same. Think of yourself in a swimming pool. Just before your head goes underwater, you take a big maximal breath. You're breathing as much as you can do. You are maximizing and utilizing your inspiratory reserve volume when you take that breath. Next is our residual volume. This is the volume of air that remains in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. So after you breathe out as hard as you possibly can, the residual volume is the amount of air that remains within the lungs. Now it's important that there's air that remains within the lungs, so there is some form of pressure in your lung. If there was no pressure in the lung, it could collapse, because like we said earlier, the lung is in a wet, quite sticky and moist state. If there was no air within the lung, it would stick together and your lung could collapse. So there needs to be some air in there at all times, and that is called your residual volume. Next is vital capacity. Now your vital capacity is a combination of your tidal volume, your IRV and your ERV. A more simple explanation is the maximum volume of air that can be exhaled after a maximal inhalation. Even easier than that, that's an example of your vital capacity. Total lung capacity, again, can easily be calculated as your vital capacity plus your residual volume. You can't use all of your total lung capacity, but you can use all of your vital capacity. And an easy way to differentiate between these two is the word vital. It's what's vital to you when you breathe, and that's the vital capacity. Total lung capacity is total, so it includes air that remains in the lungs to keep you alive. So there's a difference between these two. And total lung capacity is your vital capacity plus your residual volume. This graph now is something that you need to be familiar with. You may see this in an exam and you may have looked at it before. This graph is called the spirometer and it's showing breathing. As you can see where it starts, it's your inhalation and exhalation, inhalation, exhalation. It is normal breathing, your tidal volume. Then a massive breath is taken in. and the inspiratory reserve volume gets completely challenged. From there is a maximal exhalation, and the line goes down to the bottom of the ERV, and then it returns to normal tidal volume. As you can see on the right hand side, the vital capacity is the complete breath that's been taken, the inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume all together. That makes up your vital capacity. As you can see, there's residual volume at the bottom, and that makes up your total lung capacity. So once you've gone through each definition and you're familiar with them, come back to this graph, come back to this table and look at it, and it'll make perfect sense to you. If it doesn't, keep going back to the definitions, keep coming back to this table, and it's all you will need to learn about this particular part of the topic. Next, we need to look at the mechanics of ventilation, so how you actually breathe. So these three sections we need to discuss: respiratory muscles, volume and pressure, and accessory muscles. These are the three areas that help with our mechanics of breathing. We're going to start with the respiratory muscles. Whether you're standing up, sat at a desk, sat on a chair, slashing away on the drums, it doesn't matter, your respiratory muscles will help you all the same. We're going to start with inhalation. Your diaphragm is a respiratory muscle that sits underneath your lungs. As it contracts, it opens up and increases the lung volume, allowing air in. The intercostal muscles also contract, and they push the rib cage upwards and outwards, again increasing the size of the lungs to take in air. Exhalation, these muscles relax. Your diaphragm relaxes, your intercostal muscles relax, and you can breathe out. Next, we need to talk about volume and pressure and the relationship between the two. Now let's consider this as a fight in a boxing ring. If this ring was full of people, there'd be a big pressure on the ring, pressure on the ropes, pressure on the canvas on the floor. But if we were to stretch that ring and make it bigger, if we were to make it huge, there would be less pressure. And what this allows is more air, or more fighters into the ring, more air into the lungs. And this is the simple relationship between volume and pressure. If there's an increased capacity for a larger volume, there is a lower pressure. And vice versa, if there is a smaller volume or a decreasing volume, there is an increased pressure within the lungs, therefore air is forced out of the lungs. And that's the relationship between volume and pressure. The last thing we're going to discuss is accessory muscles. They assist with breathing. These muscles allow a greater pressure gradient, so you can have deep breathing during exercise. One of our muscles is the sternocleidomastoid. This muscle helps us to inhale. The scalenes group, again in your neck area, allow us to inhale. And your pectoralis minor helps with inhalation as well. This increases a bigger stretch, allowing more air into your lungs. Your abdominals, along with your trapezius, help with a forcible exhalation. Quick recap: inhalation, diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, increasing the volume of lung space. Volume and pressure recap: high lung volume equals low pressure, air forces in. Low lung volume equals high pressure, air forces out of the lungs. And lastly, our accessory muscles recap. During strenuous exercise, we have three muscles that help with inhalation, and your abs and trapezius help you to exhale. Now we need to look at nervous and chemical control of breathing and how we have things called receptors that help us. So how does the brain regulate breathing during exercise? Let's explore this further. In the respiratory control center in the brain, particularly in the medulla oblongata, this is where the information is processed and then a decision is made and sent back down to the body. All over our body, we have things called receptors. Now, these receptors are like detectives. They're located all over the body, connected and controlled to the central nervous system. The three receptors we're going to focus on in the respiratory system is chemoreceptors. And if you focus on the chemo bit, it's talking about the chemicals, it's talking about the change of chemicals within your blood, and that's the chemoreceptors. We have proprioreceptors, detecting movement, and stretch receptors, detecting a stretch within the lungs. A receptor detects a specific change in its location and it reports that information back to the respiratory control center, so it can make a decision and make a change within the body. Chemoreceptors, They detect chemical change in the blood. So a change to blood acidity or the pH level, if it lowers and becomes more acidic, there will be a demand to increase breathing rate and depth. We need more oxygen, so therefore we need to breathe deeper and faster. If there is a decreased carbon dioxide identified, then the breathing rate can return back to normal, and there isn't such a demand to breathe so heavily and to breathe so deep. And our chemoreceptors are the detectives sending your brain that information so it can make its changes as and when it needs to. Our next receptor is a proprioceptor. Now, the proprioceptors, they look at movement, and the way they do it is they're located towards joints, and they look at angle changes in joints, so when there's a movement. So if there's an increased movement, hence you are exercising, there will be an increased breathing rate and depth, and that information again will be sent to the RCC, and it will tell the brain to tell the lungs to breathe deeper, tell the heart to beat faster, we need more oxygen. When there's a decreased movement, just like the chemoreceptors, that breathing rate isn't in demand, it can come back to normal. And finally, the last receptor we're going to look at is a stretch receptor. No, not the type of stretching you can see on the screen now. It's nothing to do with muscle stretch, it's to do with lung stretch. So it inhibits inspiration. Now your stretch receptor comes into play when there is a massive influx of oxygen. So let's say your chemoreceptors are working and your proprioceptors are working, they're just demanding a massive influx of oxygen. Now that can't keep going forever. Your lungs can't keep taking in oxygen forever. It has to stop. So the stretch receptors detect when the lung is at its absolute maximum and when it's full. And when it identifies this, it stops inspiration, it inhibits inspiration, and it stimulates expiration, and it forces you to breathe outwards. So therefore you can not only take air in, but you're also eliminating it and breathing it out as well. And this process is what's known as the Herring-Brewer reflex. The last two sections that we need to look at are to do with gas exchange. Firstly, we're going to look at hemoglobin and how it transports oxygen around the body. So, hemoglobin's role in oxygen transportation. 98% of oxygen is transported by combining with hemoglobin within the blood, within the red blood cells. Oxygen enters this blood and it binds with the iron. That's the heme, that's what it's called, hence the hemoglobin. The iron itself is called the heme, and that's where it binds. Each molecule of hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen molecules. And this isn't a little operation. This is a major operation that happens all day long. The body has about 25 trillion red blood cells, approximately. And each of them red blood cells can carry up to 250 million hemoglobin. Each, at a particular time if need be, can have the capacity to take on 4 oxygen molecules. A major operation to help us breathe. At the end of the bronchioles, there are large capillary networks around the alveoli. Now this is key. This is really important. If the alveoli are full with oxygen, but it's not surrounded by a capillary network, we can't get the oxygen into the bloodstream, into the red blood cells where all them trillions and millions of red blood cells and hemoglobin are. If we don't have the capillary network, this operation breaks down. So it's really key that when we talk about hemoglobin and how it transports oxygen around the body, that we do talk about the link, and the link between the alveoli and the blood is the capillaries. As the blood passes through the lungs, the hemoglobin picks up oxygen, increasing the air pressure in the arterial blood. Now we're going to get into this in a bit more detail in the final unit, but this is gas exchange in a nutshell. Oxygen goes from alveoli into bloodstream, and carbon dioxide goes from bloodstream into alveoli ready to be exhaled. The oxygen is what's called dissociated. So disassociation of oxygen simply just means offloading. And this is what happens from the alveoli into the bloodstream and then wherever it needs to be. So when the bloodstream transports the oxygen around the body in the hemoglobin, it might need to be in an organ, it might need to be in a muscle. but it's offloaded. It dissociates with the hemoglobin and enters the cell. If it's the muscle cell that it enters, it's the myoglobin that it goes to from the hemoglobin, and then it's stored there ready to be used for aerobic respiration within the muscle. And for this last section, we're going to look at gas exchange. And we're going to look mainly at concentration gradients. What it means, some examples of them with the numbers associated to it, because that will help you to hit your higher marks on the exam. Like I said earlier, it's an explained topic. So there might be 3, 4, even 5 mark questions here. So the more information you have, the more chance you have of hitting them topic points. So, gas exchange. As we know, alveoli are small hollow sacs located at the end of bronchioles. Each of the alveoli is lined by a single epithelial cell, meaning it's very, very thin, allowing passive diffusion to take place between the alveoli and the capillaries. This is where the air moves. No energy is required. And I'm going to use this balloon as an example. If you look at this balloon, it's full of air. The pressure inside the balloon is very, very high. The pressure outside the balloon is lower. So when you let go, all of the air, without any energy, leaves the balloon. This is the same process that takes place between our alveoli and the capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveoli, from the capillaries, and carbon dioxide goes the other way. What we need to look at next is what's called partial pressure. Partial pressure refers to pressure of a certain gas within a mixture of gases. So again, go back to that phrase, partial pressure. Partial meaning partly, and pressure meaning the pressure within the gas. So each gas makes up a different partial aspect of the complete mixture of gases. And that's what we need to look at here. Partial pressure can be measured in millimeters of mercury or kilopascals. Now we're going to look at millimeters of mercury because I think the numbers are easier to remember, and not only that, get familiar with millimeters of mercury because you use that for blood pressure in the CV system. Movement of gases occurs when there is a partial pressure concentration gradient. Gases passively move from high concentration to low concentration, like I've just showed you with the balloon. So let's look at these concentration gradients. Oxygen partial pressure within the alveoli is high. It's around 103 millimeters of mercury. So this is when you've taken a big breath in and the oxygen has got to the end of your alveoli and it's ready to diffuse into the bloodstream. Within the bloodstream, the partial pressure of oxygen is low in the capillaries. So therefore we have a big concentration gradient. Therefore oxygen can diffuse from the alveoli into the capillaries. And this diffusion stops when that partial pressure becomes level. When we hit equilibrium, that's where the gas exchange stops taking place. There is no more concentration gradient. The capillaries and the red blood cells are therefore full of oxygen and they can go to their next destination, wherever that may be. At the same time, in reverse, the carbon dioxide at the capillaries is high because that's coming back from the muscles, coming back from aerobic respiration as a waste product. And it's high at 46 millimeters of mercury. Within the alveoli, it's slightly lower at 40 millimeters of mercury. So therefore, because there's a concentration gradient, it can offload into the alveoli ready to be exhaled. These concentration gradients happen exactly the same at the muscle to offload oxygen, which is high in the capillary, low in the muscle. Therefore, there's a concentration gradient and the passive diffusion can take place again into the cell and oxygen can be used as part of respiration. Good luck with your studies. If you're a teacher looking for resources on Unit 2, Cardiorespiratory System, you can visit the Physical Educator TES site and you can pick up respiratory system and CV system resources in the shop there. Thank you for visiting the Physical Educator. See you next time.